Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Conduit. And thank you for being here. We know it is a tube strike today, so thanks for making the journeys. And it's great to see so many of you here. My name is Ashad Lanrol. I'm part of our program team, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to this really important and interesting discussion on deep sea mining and whether it poses an unjustifiable environmental and existential risk. Tonight's discussion is in partnership with On Frontline and Pranveera Shema-Smith and supported by Luke Douglas Home and the Charles Douglas Home Memorial Trust. So towards the end of the discussion, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. I'll be in the audience with a microphone, so please do keep those in mind and try keep them brief as well. So I'm now going to be handing over to our chair for tonight's discussion, Jeevan Vasagar. Jeevan is the climate editor of The Observer and the author of Surge, The Race Against the Most Destructive Force in Nature, which we actually have on sale from my colleague Lily in the corner. So please do pick up a copy at the end of the show as well. So Jeevan, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Asha. So I'm Jeevan Vasagar. I'm climate editor of The Observer. As Asha's mentioned, I'm the author of a book called The Surge, which is about floods. And in particular, it's about humanity's relationship with the environment, our relationship with nature, and how we've screwed it up time after time. So there may be echoes of that book in today's conversation. In a moment, we're going to take you down to the bottom of the ocean. But before we do that, we're going to watch a short video. We invited the Metals Company, who are a deep sea mining company, to be with us today. They couldn't be with us today, but they've sent us this thoughtful video message. So we'll just watch that first.
The claim is that biodiversity loss is inevitable from deep sea mining. The results that we're getting from both our studies and others, such as the SmartX study, I believe will challenge that narrative moving forward as we collect more information. Because we are leaving these reserve areas behind, which are genetic reservoirs, so organisms will survive to basically recolonize. Also, the mining leases are not strip mined, as people like to portray. They're only parts of each mining lease will be mined, so what's left is a mosaic. So what we have is areas that have been, nodules have been collected, and then areas that have been untouched. And those areas that have been touched, now we know, won't be impacted by the plume, because that was the other narrative, that even the areas that are untouched are going to be significantly impacted by your plume. We now know that's not the case. In the abyssal plain, there's lots of areas that have few nodules, there's lots of areas that are just sediment only, and then there's areas that have lots of nodules. If we collect nodules from one area, we're just changing the sediment to nodule proportion of that part of the seabed. So we're changing the proportion of those habitat types. Certainly wouldn't describe it as habitat destruction, it's habitat modification.
If you thought that was boring, bear in mind that the company wanted us to show you a 6.5-hour version of that, director's cut, so we've spared you this evening. If I can have my panelists on stage, please. So tonight, thank you so much. Bless you. Okay, you've earned your commission. So imagine tonight that we're not in this beautiful room in central London. Imagine that we're thousands of meters below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, deep in the freezing darkness, something like the Bakerloo Line. Oliver, who is the chief executive of Nekton, tell us a little bit about conditions down there. Take us on a Jules Verne journey to begin our evening.
Thank you. That's quite a challenge. But I was a submersible pilot, not a very good one, so I've had some experience in the deep sea. I think the best place to start is the universal picture, because as things stand currently, Earth is the only known place in the universe where there is complex life, complex biology, and it's taken 4 billion years to get to where we are. And the great value of what lives in our ocean is not mineral or oil or gas, but it's biological. It's our planet's superpower. If an alien was to land here, and they'll probably give me a call. I run something called the Ocean Census. Our responsibility is to discover life in the sea. And they'll probably want to know about the extraordinary biology that lives in our sea. And over 4 billion years, the reason why life in our ocean is our planet's superpower is because of the biological, chemical, and genetic properties and interactions which occur with life within our ocean.
And Oliver, just before we get deeper into this, just to explain a bit of the context, these are really extraordinary conditions down at the bottom of the ocean, aren't they? Just give us a sense of what it's like down there, and how comfortable a human being might find it.
Well, once we leave the atmospheric cradle of our terrestrial beings, obviously there's no oxygen down there, so we can't breathe. That's the first challenge. But we lose light as we go further down to sort of, we lose light about 200-300 meters, and there's very little light. Yes, there are little fragments that go a bit further down to 1,000 or so. But then there's pressure, which grows as you go down. So every 10 meters you go down, you get one more atmosphere of pressure. So down at full ocean depth, about 11,000 meters or so, or this mining area which they're talking about, which is 4,000 or 5,000 meters or shallower at times, you're experiencing extraordinary pressures. And it's salty, which isn't great for equipment, and all sorts of other things as well.
Okay, and
Dark.
so dark. Say again.
Dark.
So no
Under
photosynthesis, high pressure, extremely cold and salty.
Yeah.
What are the creatures that live down there, and how are they adapted to these extraordinary conditions?
Well, we don't actually know how much lives in our sea. So at the moment, we estimate there's between 1 and 2.2 million creatures in the ocean, of which we found about 10%. So of those animals, there is life from the shallows down to the great depths, and particularly in these mining areas, there is a lot of biodiversity that's been identified in those areas, and that ranges from your charismatics. So you get your whales and sharks at great depth. You've got corals, which go down to great depths as well. Fish, of course, but then all sorts of other animals of which we just don't know what's there. So it's very hard to protect what we don't actually know exists.
And when people talk about deep sea mining, we're obviously talking about the very base of the sea, right down in the abyss. Are there creatures living down there, as far as we know?
Yes, everywhere.
Okay, and what does live down there?
Well, pick a place, and I can maybe tell you. I mean,
Let's
different depths and different places.
Let's talk about the Pacific and the Clarion-Clipperton zone, and right at the bottom of the Pacific.
So down on the seabed, down in those areas, you have a whole range of crustacea. There are fish. There are there's any number of. There's a huge variety of different taxa, which have been. If we look at the discoveries of new species, which the NHM made, for example, there were hundreds of different taxa in different types of species that were found.
Yeah, this is the Natural History Museum last year.
Yes.
Yeah.
Their research, which they did in the Pacific in the mining area.
Yeah.
So we know there's lots of that.
Oliver, just tell me a bit about the process of developing our scientific understanding of the deep sea. So you said a minute ago, very little is known. We're sort of just beginning to understand what's down there. Just fill me in on that. How little do we know, and how much are we expanding our knowledge right now?
Well, if we look at just species knowledge, then we know about 10%, maybe. Although there's a huge range of that estimation. So at the moment, we've discovered about 250,000 species. So there's 90% of our biological inventory, we don't know what it is, essentially. So there's lots of guesses that could be made about what we think it is, and predictions and projections. But fundamentally, we don't know. Ocean science started in the Challenger expeditions in the late 1800s, so it's a relatively new science. A recent report came out last year which said that we've had eyes on a fraction of 1% of the deep sea. So very little is actually known.
And is that biodiversity that you've just talked about a surprise, given how inhospitable the conditions are? I mean, what does it tell us about life that it continues to thrive in these circumstances?
Well, it tells us that the diversity of life on our planet has evolved from our ocean, and it took a while. It took 3 billion years to go from single cellular to multicellular, and where we are now is what's left from 5 major extinction events. So 99% of life on Earth is already extinct. What we have left, and their chemical, biological, genetic properties and interactions, that's the stuff which is making oxygen, sequestering our carbon, feeding billions of us, regulating our climate. It's the life that makes all life possible on Earth.
Fortunately, the metals company is coming for us with another major extinction event. And to talk about that, Luke McMillan, a journalist, you've been exploring many angles, really, of this story. I just want to talk about the economics of this for a moment. So on the face of it, it does seem extraordinary, the idea of going into one of the most alien, difficult places in the world, and extracting minerals from there. Could you just tell me a little bit about what it is that companies are seeking to extract from the ocean floor and why those materials matter?
So if you think where we are as a planet, we're looking to transition to clean, green energy. We are all, well, most of us, agreeing that fossil fuels are bad.
Fewer every day.
That the climate crisis is real. And we need to move away from using fossil fuels and to a point where we can rely on wind farms, solar farms, where we can have electric cars. You can see around London now, you walk out of here and you often almost get run over by a taxi because you can't hear it coming.
So we're basically electrifying all of modern civilization, and
Yes.
to do that, we need huge amounts of minerals.
Yeah,
Essentially.
we need huge amounts of cobalt, nickel, which you will find terrestrially in the majority of it. 70% of it is found in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the issues we have there are deforestation. We have lots of human rights issues in terms of child labor.
Okay, but just to stay, we'll come back to the Congo in a moment, but just to stay on the ocean floor, what is down there?
What is down there? So the one thing that everyone's looking at the moment are the polymetallic nodules. So basically, these small fist-sized rocks on the floor that have formed over millions of years. So if you imagine a shark tooth or a bit of shell has settled on the ocean floor over millions of years, metals that have dissolved in the water, basically the atoms of that stick to these fragments. A bit like if you think about the buildup of limescale in a kettle, that over millions and millions of years. So if you cut one of the nodules open, it's almost like the rings inside a tree.
Okay.
And within those are these precious metals.
And how do you extract these from the ocean floor? Is there a giant vacuum cleaner involved?
It is basically a giant vacuum cleaner, yeah. So you would, as you saw the video from the metal company that they provided, that then gets sucked up and to a ship, and then that's processed, and all the sediment that's sucked up with the nodules is then kind of released back into the ocean. So they're talking about the plume and the issues with the plume, but there's two levels of plume.
Could you
as well.
explain what is the plume?
Yeah, so the plume is basically everything that's kicked up by the machines that are used to extract the nodules. And so it's basically all the sediment which is tossed up into the air, which you saw the AI video, that it spreads a lot further than that video. And that then kind of blankets
Tossed
everything.
up into the air. You mean tossed up through the ocean?
Through the ocean, yes.
Okay.
And then that basically causes a blanket which then covers all the species below it. So
This isn't a lot of fun for the fish.
not a lot of fun for the fish.
Okay.
No.
All right, I want to come back to the environmental consequences with you, Oliver, in a moment. But before we do, Louisa Casson, deep sea mining campaigner, Greenpeace International. I just want to talk about the rules and just sort of establish kind of what the rules are, what they aren't in terms of deep sea mining. So where are we at the moment in terms of what countries have agreed upon around extraction of these minerals that Lucas just described?
So at the moment, no deep sea mining is happening at a commercial scale. Right. And initially it's still a nascent, very speculative industry. Mm-hmm. A few companies have tried to start within national waters. Where they've tried, that hasn't worked for a variety of reasons, often a lot of public pushback, but also a lot of economic concerns and companies going bankrupt. And then at the international level, and the sort of Clarion-Clipperton zone in the Pacific between Mexico and Hawaii is really the sort of main area that these sort of handful of companies are looking at. At the moment, governments have not agreed on a mining code, on rules that would actually allow for.
And this has been going on for some time, right? They've been talking about this for years.
Yes. Yeah. So the sort of the law of the sea, which is sort of like the international constitution of the oceans, was negotiated, agreed in the 1980s. The deep sea mining part took longer to actually agree, so that took us into sort of 1994. Yeah. And then initially, governments did agree rules to allow exploration, so that kind of prospecting and sort of development of technology, but they haven't yet given that go-ahead to allow mining to start. Okay. And I think we're seeing from some of these companies getting quite impatient. Yeah. The metals company triggered this sort of obscure legal provision a few years ago, essentially setting an ultimatum for governments saying, we want to start mining. They did
Yeah.
this in the middle of the pandemic and said, you need to finish your rules within 2 years, or we will put in an application, even in the absence of any rules. I think conversely, what actually happened there is we saw a lot of governments, when the question was sort of forced of saying, are you going to allow this to happen? That's when we started to see more and more governments calling for a moratorium for the first time.
Yeah. So we'll come back to the business side of this in a moment, but could you just explain something for me, which is, why is it so difficult to agree rules? I mean, what are some of the challenges? I imagine there are a number of challenges in terms of like trying to agree how to do this, but what's been holding this up?
I mean, I think there are the big overarching questions of, we are talking about doing this way out in the ocean, about 4 kilometers below the surface of the waves, and in one of our planet's last remaining intact ecosystems. You know, we know that we're in a climate emergency, we're in a nature crisis. There are vanishingly few places on this planet that are still a wilderness. And I think, you know, when the initial sort of law of the sea was created, there was the sense of, oh, there can't be much down there. And actually, our understanding since then has shown there's a lot down there, and it's incredibly important as a life support system for this planet. So I think governments are really grappling with that of, do we really want to be held responsible of opening up one of our last remaining intact ecosystems at this point in history? You know, I think they are learning from the examples of where it's been tried in national waters, and governments like Papua New Guinea were left with a bill of over $100 million when the company went bankrupt and couldn't start mining. So there's issues of liability, financial questions.
What was the bill for? Like, what did Papua New Guinea have to pay for?
So they had sort of participated in that project and had put quite a lot of money in, and then the company, which was a sort of predecessor of the metals company, a lot of the same executives involved, actually weren't able to do it, and eventually sort of the project collapsed, so that the government essentially lost out on that investment they had placed. And, you know, the Prime Minister said, I wish we'd never got involved. So I think there are these sort of big questions, and, you know, there are also these actually quite utopian principles which are in the law of the sea. So the international seabed is legally known as the common heritage of mankind. Now, we would always say humankind because, you know, women did exist in the 1980s. But, you know, that is actually a pretty remarkable legal agreement that was forged by the international community to say, actually, deep sea mining can only start if it proves that it has a benefit to humanity. At the moment, we're not seeing that condition has been met. And equally, governments have the legal responsibility to protect the marine environment, to avoid harm. And again, from all the scientific warnings, very, very difficult right now to say deep sea mining meets that threshold.
Okay, we'll come back to this, the diplomacy and the rules in a moment. But Oliver, I want to ask you a little bit about the environmental side of this and the environmental impacts. We watched that beautiful corporate video at the start of the evening. It showed these carefully ring-fenced habitats for the little critters down there. What's your concern about the potential impact of mining on the deep sea?
Well, there's a few things. I mean, there are a few corrections to be made to the statements which were made first of all.
This could take us all evening. So.
I'll be brief. Firstly, you know, the destruction of biodiversity. There have been some studies which show that it is widespread. 37% biodiversity loss in an area which was with a large-scale area which was being mined for test mining recently, particularly in this area. So we know it does deliver. It does result in biodiversity loss. Sediment plumes as well made a statement that it doesn't cause effect. That's unknown. We don't know the scale and the impact of those sediment plumes at the moment. Probably they will contribute heavy metals and toxins into the water. They smother biodiversity on the seabed, and also, you know, they kick up the sediment, which is a massive carbon store. So the argument about this being good for the environment doesn't take into account the extraordinary quantities of carbon which could be released from the mining as well. So those are just a few of the environmental impacts which have already been documented. The key thing to all of that, though, is which is why there is a moratorium on it, that the science is not complete. We do not know the impact of what will happen from deep sea mining. We have very severe implications of what it looks like, which is devastating and catastrophic. But the argument around the moratorium is say, well, we know so little about the ocean. We need to do more scientific studies to be able to evaluate what the impact is. And that's the minimum threshold which should be expected of a decision of this order.
I just want to stay on the biology of the deep sea for a moment, because obviously we should care about the creatures that we share the planet with for their own sake and not for their usefulness to us. But I've read, and please just tell me a bit more about this, that because of the extreme conditions these creatures live under, their biology is unusual, extraordinary, and does hold the potential for some interesting things when it comes to medical science. And I wonder if you could just talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, hydrothermal vents, which is another area which could be potentially mined as well. One of my favorite animals down there is the cone snail, which secretes iron. It's also got a painkiller that's 1,000 times more powerful than morphine and non-addictive. I don't know how they figured that out, but someone clever did.
I want some.
Yeah. And there are, frontline drugs for HIV/AIDS and cystic fibrosis and cancers and even COVID have come from the biological properties of animals which have adapted to live in these extreme conditions.
Extraordinary. Okay. Luke, I want to ask you a question about the environmental consequences of this. I mean, you mentioned the Congo a few minutes ago. If a deep sea mining company was here, they might well say, come on, mining is a dirty business. Wherever you go in the world, it's also a necessary business. The buildings we live in, the wires that provide our electricity, everything we rely on for the modern world requires mines to be in business. Perhaps this is better than employing kids in the Congo, than chopping down rainforest in Indonesia. How would you respond to that argument?
I think the argument, so basically, if you're comparing where we are now in terms of terrestrial mining, and we go back to the Congo, where 70% of a lot of the metals are found in the Congo, and there's obvious disruption. But then you look at the deep sea mining, and the argument is that this is a lot more, a lesser carbon footprint, should we say. But that doesn't take into consideration the figures that they use is the actual kind of processing of it, not the actual collection. So you've got to be very careful of how you look at things when you look at the figures that they're using to back up their case. But also, as Oliver said, there is the carbon sequestration, the amount of carbon that gets kicked up. So if you think of over hundreds of thousands of years, animals that are sinking to the bottom and taking that carbon with them that's locked down there for millennia, and then releasing that, and it can make its way to the surface, and then the carbon that's released back into the atmosphere, then we just don't know. And we were saying briefly before this, it's the only time, one of the few times where science is actually keeping up with the economics of all of this. So we're in a unique position where we have the proponents arguing with the scientists in real time, rather than after the fact.
Right.
Which
after the destruction's done. Okay, but let's just sort of deal with a central point that a proponent of deep sea mining might make, which is the alternative to deep sea mining is not extracting these minerals. It's blowing up mountains on land instead and causing harm in different ways.
Or it's recycling.
Yeah.
Or it's using the resources that we all already have mined and repurposing them and reusing them, which is entirely possible if nations wanted to go down that route.
Oliver,
just on the scale of mining as well, terrestrial versus the sea. One report I read showed that for nickel, for example, an average amount of nickel which can come out of a terrestrial mine per hectare is about 563, and that's a three-dimensional environment that they're mining.
Yeah.
The ocean will generate about, let me get my figures accurate, 1.5 tons per hectare.
Yeah.
So the scale of mining operations which are required to start to produce the kind of numbers which TMC and others are presenting it shows you that it's not comparable at all. I mean, you're talking about vastly different areas.
You mean that you need to operate on a much larger scale in the deep sea,
yes,
compared
exactly.
to terrestrial mining?
Yes.
Okay. Louisa, I want to come back to you on the diplomacy of this and on a bit of what's behind it. So obviously in the last couple of years, we've seen an increasing kind of obsession in the White House with critical minerals. And I wouldn't assume this is simply to do with how green the Trump administration is. Perhaps it is. But let's just talk a little bit about what's behind that, because I guess kind of one obvious point to make is that if you look at who controls the extraction and processing of critical minerals at the moment, wherever in the world they are, for example, in Indonesia, it's often one of the US's strategic rivals. So what do you think is going on here?
So, I mean, I think, a key sort of motivation here is really this sort of, jostling on who has a dominant position in minerals. I think what's interesting is actually the US could have had a leadership position, but obviously, their position on the green transition has entirely flip-flopped over the last presidential administrations. And I think what we have actually seen is, particularly after the Paris Agreement on climate change was agreed, that actually, a lot of the long-term planning that China had done actually started to really kick in, and they do now have an incredibly dominant position, both on electric vehicle production, but also in terms of minerals. And I think what we need to remember, though, is that it's really the sort of processing and the refining is where China has that primary position. I think, we have obviously seen minerals become this political hot potato, and suddenly everyone has a hot take on minerals. But actually, there's a lot of misinformation there. And I think also this sort of real effort to try and simplify what is quite complex. So I think, you get these sort of lines from mining companies of rainforests or oceans, which one do you want to protect, rather than looking at the vast range of possibilities.
Do we shoot the puppy or the kitten?
Exactly. And it sort of benefits them to try and tell this as a falsely narrow choice, when, as Luke was saying, there are so many different choices. The way that this energy transition could look opens up so many possibilities. What do we prioritize minerals for? How are we recycling and reusing the minerals that have already been mined? I mean, the lesson that we should not learn from the damage of mining on land is, let's mine more of the planet, particularly in places where we may not even be able to see the full impacts or even understand the true scale of the damage. And so I think, it sort of felt like, because we had got to this stage where, despite the metals company pushing very hard and using these sort of obscure levers internationally to try and get approval for mining, and the international community actually holding strong. There are a lot of political divisions in the world right now, including at the International Seabed Authority. But it does feel like where there is unity is actually governments are in a broad agreement that they're not ready to start deep sea mining now. And I think that caused a real problem to companies like the metals company. And they then sort of tried to jump on the bandwagon of President Trump, who is, clearly very interested in looking at territories and resources that do not belong to him. And, now they have put in this very, very controversial application to try and essentially go round the entire international process and seek unilateral approval for deep sea mining.
There's a lot in your answer, Louisa. And for those who haven't followed the debate very closely, as you have, I just want to unpack that a little bit more and a little bit more slowly. So basically, as you outlined a minute ago, countries are trying to agree on this code for mining, and that seems to have accelerated in recent years. So we're now sort of pushing to a point where there might be a code that happens this year. But well,
I think that's highly unlikely.
Okay.
I think there's a few sort of vested interests in saying, are we nearly there?
Right.
But actually, I think what we're seeing actually is more and more governments being very reticent, and that's why we're seeing President Macron, President Lula actually saying, we do not want to allow deep sea mining to start, and actually calling for a moratorium, a precautionary pause. And that's now 40 countries, more than half of the G7, more than half of European Union member states are calling for a moratorium. And while they are still negotiating a mining code, there are major issues that remain unresolved because of political differences, or because of actually the lack of scientific knowledge to know what kind of harm are you even preventing.
Yeah.
I mean, a scientist said to me once, the idea of mining the deep sea is like burning a library when you haven't even finished reading the first book, because there is so much more that we have to discover. 90% of the species that we're finding in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone are totally new to science. So I think that is becoming a bigger and bigger question. But obviously that is frustrating for these mining startups who are burning through cash and have no way of making money at the moment until they're allowed to start deep sea mining. And that's becoming more and more questionable about whether they would ever get that approval through an internationally legitimate process.
And we'll come back to the mining company in a moment, but I just wanted to ask another question about the Trump administration and where they stand in relation to this process. So it is the case that countries can mine the deep sea within their own territorial waters as they wish, essentially.
That's a sovereign decision.
So what we're talking about are international waters. What is the approach that the US is currently taking on this, and how does it set them at odds with other countries?
So the US has this sort of old law from 1980, before the Law of the Sea came into effect.
Right.
And a few different governments were sort of developing this as they were, there was interest from big fossil fuel companies back in the 1970s. Actually, most of them have now pulled out. But a number of countries sort of started developing their own deep sea mining rules, thinking, is this something that's going to take off? there was then the Law of the Sea, and while 170 governments have joined that and have ratified that, the US has not ratified that. We know that, that's not a huge surprise. The US often doesn't join these sort of international agreements fully, although the US, has continually attended the negotiations and was even sort of participating in them. Then sort of you come to about a year ago, the metals company released a press release in the middle of the International Seabed Authority negotiations saying, we're actually, we don't think this process is going to deliver fast enough or commercially viable regulations for us.
Right.
And so we're actually going to dig up this really archaic law from the 1980s, and we're going to put in a mining application that would only need permission from the US administration. This was met with huge pushback from ministers, from leaders across the world. It's widely seen as in violation of international law. Obviously, that's something that President Trump may not care so much about. But it does create this sort of real issue for the metals company. I think it definitely wasn't their first choice. They clearly spent years trying to get approval through the ISA. And that's because deep sea mining would be an international supply chain. And actually, the Law of the Sea is really clear that if you are part of it, and 170 governments in the world are, you cannot allow one single government to sort of seize this common heritage of humankind, this global commons, this global commons. It's sort of, alienating what should be internationally governed. And so actually what that means...
So there might be a practical question here about how easy it is to process what you've extracted.
Exactly.
Okay.
The metals company do not own their own ship. That is owned by a Swiss-Dutch company. The Swiss and Dutch governments are part of the Law of the Sea, so they will face the need to actually put in measures to stop that Swiss and Dutch company from providing the mining ship, from providing the mining machine. The metals company were planning to process in Japan and Indonesia. Again, those states are bound by the Law of the Sea.
Right.
So actually there are all sorts of feasibility questions as well as political and legal hurdles. And I think, so in some ways what we really need to see this sort of effort to try and get Trump's unilateral approval as kind of a race to the bottom in regulatory standards. It's kind of being used
both
to try
metaphorically
and get,
literally. Okay.
yes, trying to get governments to speed up and deliver a mining code. But the only way to have a mining code soon would actually be for governments to jettison their own obligations to protect the marine environment, to make sure it delivers benefit for humankind, when actually that's, actually what we're seeing is that deep sea mining is likely to move us in the wrong direction. So I think it's really important for the international community to actually stand up to essentially this bullying and not appease rogue actors, and actually to stand strong and, and to actually formally put in place a moratorium, because while we're seeing more and more calls for it, and I think, the current situation has been described as a sort of de facto moratorium because it's not legally allowed to start.
Yeah.
But what we don't have is that clarity for the companies as well, that actually right now the world is not ready to start deep sea mining. So that's what we want to see governments formally agree, like they have, on in Antarctica, when there were discussions in the 90s about should we open up Antarctica to mining. The idea now of mining Antarctica seems crazy, but that's because governments set very clearly a legal restriction so that, that is not possible. Governments will not give approval to mine Antarctica, and they should do the same for a similar kind of international space, which is the deep sea.
Thank you, Louisa. I have many more questions for all of you, but before we get into those, I'd love to hear a little bit from the audience. And Asha is roving with a mic, so please just raise your hands, wave. It can be a question or a comment, but please keep it brief so we can get in as many of you as possible. There is a hand raised at the front, another hand raised at the back. And what will be lovely... we'll take two at a time, but what would be lovely is if there is a woman who could speak first, which I often find... because it is always a man who raises his hand first. With no offense to you, sir. Yes.
Sure. So considering the technical complication of doing this mining and the fact that you're saying it's an order of magnitude higher to mine on land than to mine on the sea, what is the cost-benefit analysis for these companies themselves? Because presumably for them to continue advocating at this level, they are projecting profit margins that would justify decades worth of both advocacy and sunk cost potentially. So that's the first question, is how long would it take them to start turning a profit, and why do they consider those profits to be kind of hypothetically huge? And the second is, who is putting in the venture capital, aside from governments like Indonesia, who might fund kind of domestic projects, who is propping up companies like the mining company?
Great question. You can just pass the mic to the gentleman next to you. Thank you.
Yes, well, thanks for the discussion. There was a discussion of the biological benefits of some of the biodiversity there. I was wondering what rules govern the bioprospecting in these areas, and is there a potential counterweight then from the partisans of bioprospecting against those of mining?
Two brilliant questions. Thank you. Luke, do you want to start on the business case?
Yeah, so they've valued, so there's billions of tons of, if you just look at the nodules, billions of tons, and they estimate that it's worth somewhere between $7 and $13 trillion. So there's your business case straight off. But so it gets to a point where there is a lot of sunk cost, but you keep on going that extra mile if at some point it unlocks. And then if you look at the metals company leading the way on everything in terms of development of technology, doing the research and what have you, they are all in because they know that this is the golden goose that has billions of golden nodule eggs on the bottom of the floor or the bottom of the seabed. In terms of like venture capitalists, is that something that you've looked at Greenpeace?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the metals company themselves, their CEO and a number of their sort of board of directors have personally invested quite a lot in it. Their CEO had been part of that earlier failed deep sea mining venture that I mentioned in Papua New Guinea. He sort of pulled out just before it all collapsed. So he actually made quite a lot of money personally from that and is using that to sort of to finance the metals company. They have some investments from this Swiss-Dutch company called Allseas, who are a private company. So I think it is quite a lot of that kind of, quite small scale, quite startup mentality. What we've seen is this sort of shift away from some of the mining majors. I mentioned in the 1970s, you did have some of the major players interested in this. Actually, a lot of them have pulled out. I think Glencore have a sort of offtake agreement that's remaining. The Anglo-American have pulled out. Rio Tinto are actually calling for a moratorium. And companies like Lockheed Martin, the sort of weapons manufacturer, they were actually the owner of the UK deep sea mining company. Not many people may know that we do have a deep sea mining company in the UK. It was owned by Lockheed Martin, and they actually pulled out a few years ago. And now it's a Norwegian startup. They also went bankrupt. So now it's a sort of American company. So there's quite a lot of sort of shifts in ownership, and it is quite a precarious position for the companies because at the moment there isn't a path to revenue.
Oliver, and we're just on that. This a report which I read also showed the role of the Russian shadow state in at least 7 of 11 companies which are investigated as well.
Oliver, you've met the chief executive of the metals company. What's your impression of him?
I've met him and he came on our podcast a few years ago. He comes from a PR background. He's been a director of a number of companies, many of which are on the public record here in the UK, and you can see their disclosures. A lot of them have not done well. A lot of them have gone bankrupt. There's been cases brought against him on a range of different issues, not least one strange one where he was the director of a company that was responsible for a cleanup in Canada waters. And he managed to use those funds to buy a $2 million collection of wines from that. So he's got a reputation, shall we say, and that's public information which you can find at Companies House and other things.
Go around to his house for a glass of wine. Would you like to take the bioprospecting question about the genetic heritage of the sea?
Well, on the policy side, you may know a little bit on that, and I'm happy to.
You can add on for sure. So you may know that earlier this year, a brand new ocean agreement came into force, the High Seas Treaty, sometimes called sort of UN Ocean Treaty. And that is designed to actually fill a big gap in ocean governance, which was that there wasn't actually a way for governments to really work together to protect biodiversity. But the part of that agreement is also around marine genetic resources. So it includes new obligations for governments to really actually safeguard marine genetic resources and then to distribute the benefits more equitably. So that's actually just come in. And I think that actually raises a really interesting question of, do we actually start to see more lobbying from the pharmaceutical industry, perhaps against deep sea mining? We already see on the fisheries side, actually the seafood sector are some of the loudest voices against deep sea mining, and I think played a really pivotal role in actually preventing the Norwegian government from opening up parts of the Arctic because of the damage that there could be to fisheries. So
What does equitably mean in that context, Louisa? Because presumably there are some teeny tiny Pacific countries that would quite like a piece of this.
So I think particularly with bioprospecting, that has been one of the big concerns, is that actually, while we have a regime on land for some of the genetic resources that have been found, has that actually created benefit for many of those countries that obviously hold still a lot of the biodiversity, whereas in the global north, we have destroyed a lot of our biodiversity. And so, that was a really key priority for a lot of developing nations to actually try and get rules that ensure fairer sharing. It gets very, very complicated in the sort of legal side. But in the deep sea mining negotiations, that's also an area which I think is holding up a mining code being agreed, because benefit sharing rules on what could the finances look like from deep sea mining operations. We did some analysis that on the current proposals that are on the table, most of the global south would receive about 0.001% of their GDP in a situation where you had about 6 mines operating, within the next 5 to 10 years. That isn't the big numbers that are being talked up by some of these companies. And so again, I think the question becomes, is it worth it? Would we destroy what we already know, which would be irreversible and unavoidable harm and loss of biodiversity when we're already in a nature crisis? There's so much that we might disrupt that we don't even fully understand yet how it may directly benefit us. And for what would we gain from that? And I think that's starting to be more and more of a political calculation for governments.
Yeah, thank you. And there's a couple of things I think within there. One, from a marine genetic resources side of things, that benefit sharing agreement around the High Seas Treaty is not there yet. That we just ratified it. It represents a generational opportunity for how the Great Collective Commons are managed, but it's not there yet. The other thing which needs to be contended with is that traditionally marine science and marine genetic resource extraction and other things has been conducted by the global north. And a lot of that wealth has flowed outward from the global south to the global north. So the question of equity is really, really important for a lot of small island developing states or large ocean states, as they prefer to be called, rightly so. And so these negotiations around the benefit sharing agreement of the collective commons is anchored to a history of colonial science, or parachute science as it's known, where scientists come in and grab stuff and take the data and biological samples with them, alongside the utilization of that genetic materials by pharmaceuticals, by pharmaceutical companies, and how they utilize it. One particular thing which I found was rather weird, and maybe a wonderful journalist here can investigate it, is about 50% of all patents related to a marine genetic resource genes and the genetic information are owned by one company, which is BASF. What they're up to with that and why they have that question, which needs answering.
Interesting story. Okay, let's take a couple more questions if we can. There's a hand raised at the back and another one in the back row too.
Hello. Firstly, can I start off by saying I completely endorse and support the comments around not mining the seabed. But I think as somebody who works in the renewable energy industry, I'm always quite curious about understanding what the trade-offs are. And obviously there was a lot of questions around the minerals that we need to really see electrification and transition happen from a fossil fuel-based economy or fossil fuel-based systems through to renewable-based systems. And how, there's certain comments being made about cobalt, but recognizing how technologies change, et cetera, and all the rest of it. Are we actually having an honest conversation about what are the minerals that we need to see a transition accurately appear, and actually there are no perfect solutions, and that trade-offs will need to be made in order to extract those materials, albeit circularity is an important thing, but it's not going to give us what we need in terms of volumes. Are we having that proper conversation about what we actually need in order to achieve what some would see as the lesser evil or the least worst solution?
Great question. Thank you. There's another in the back row, and if I can take a third on the side as well.
Thank you. Yeah. My question is, as consumers and citizens, what can we do to help? What can we do to support the right kind of transition and to support campaigns that prevent the kind of, and I'm going to be totally biased here, I love the oceans, the destruction of ocean habitats? Yeah, that's my question.
And Luke.
Just very quickly, please. The metals company, TMC, have done 4 pieces of scientific research at least. Can you tell me about that, please?
Oliver, do you want to take that question, the last one first?
I'm afraid I haven't read their papers, so no.
Okay.
Wouldn't be a fair description, I'm afraid.
Luke, are you open to taking that?
Yeah, so as part of the investigation that I put together, soon to appear in Oceanographic, a big part of it was looking into the research that's been done around nodules, about deep sea mining. So I spent a lot of time reading these journals, investigations, the scientific research. And then you get to the point where there are discoveries that are not in the best interest of the metals company, even though those journals have the metal company paid authors within them, and then these journals are then subject to rebuttal from authors that are also paid by the metals company. So you get these bits of research that are, from my point of view, overwhelmingly pointing in the direction that we need to keep on investigating. We can't make decisions based on these research. So one of the pieces that the metals company did was, when they were looking, they discovered that there was some oxygen. They basically covered over these nodules, and they got a reading of oxygen. And this whole thing, if you Google dark oxygen, they thought that the nodules had an electric capacity, which was then splitting water and then releasing oxygen. And what does that mean for the ecosystem if these nodules are releasing oxygen into the ocean? So that was an investigation, and that's been rebutted hard, and they say that there's no proof that it was the modules, etc., etc. So there is another investigation going on, and the results are going to be made available at the end of this year as to whether that dark oxygen is coming from the nodules, whether it was an accident, etc. But TMC are quickly turning around and saying that's absolute nonsense. There's no way that there's any oxygen coming out of those. The experiments were done poorly, as bad readings, bad hypothesis, but they're happy to just shut it down because it's not in their benefit for this discovery to be there. So the funding was by a company called Nori, which are subsidized by TMC. So it's all very much interlinked. Yes.
Oliver, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah. So yeah, they as you were saying, there was an interlink to the funding of that piece of research, which they were quick to tried to shut down. But amongst the scientific community, and the vast majority of scientists, which I've spoken to about dark oxygen in particular, is that and the rebuttals which are presented by the lead scientist on it, he's presented every case that that show that in his mind that dark oxygen is being produced. The further experiments which they're doing are not funded by TMC. They're trying to shut it down and close it off. But if you look at the rebuttal paper on dark oxygen, it is led by the TMC scientist itself. It's not peer reviewed by other scientists. So you have to look and pull it apart to really evaluate, well, who is this rebuttal coming from? What's the motivation behind it? Does it stack up scientifically? And the scientific community, by and large, are saying, these rebuttals are absolute nonsense.
Luke, do you want to take the excellent question about trade-offs? Circularity is not enough. We need to have an honest conversation about what the trade-offs are for if we want electrification.
So one thing that I tried to do when I was writing about all of this was come at it from a neutral standpoint, and to present something that was fair to both sides, look at the argument, and then look at how we've got to this point. And we are at a point, as we were saying before, we're at this moment of green transition where we need to come up with a way of powering our electric cars, to storing the energy that we get from solar and wind farms. And it's how do we do that on a scale where we can remove fossil fuels completely. And as you said before, that there are other options, but I think people have zeroed in on deep sea mining as our only alternative to terrestrial mining and the only way that we are going to get to the point that we need to get to. But I think that is also driven by the financial benefits to these companies that are looking, and they are presenting this as the only alternative. So the trade-offs, if you look at it, and I know exactly where you're coming from, because you say we need to move away from fossil fuels, so therefore we need the metals. Where do we get the metals from in such great quantities that we can get rid of fossil fuels completely? And I think that it comes down to a point that we need to know for sure the damage that this will produce before we can press go or say no. And that's only going to be driven by the science. And until we get to the point where every argument is kind of put to bed with TMC and the other mining companies, they're going to keep pressing on this. But so I think it's that the science is going to win out here, and that's what we need to do in order to present that case.
Oliver, just looking at one particular, again, my research, so excuse me going to my notes, but lithium iron phosphate batteries, for example, now supply almost half of the global electric car market. And that's up from less than 10% in 2020. And that's at the expense of the dominant nickel-based batteries. So just within the last few years, we're seeing a shift in what minerals that we're looking for. And I think the question you're asking is really key. It's like that we're being presented with views from the TMC and others to say, we need these metals, this is why we need it, la, 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 la. But if you drill into the economics of these arguments, it doesn't add up. We're seeing a flip from those metals, which they're saying we need, into alternatives. And science and technological development are providing those solutions. We're seeing it time and time again in the last few years, particularly around EV batteries.
Louisa, the question I think for you, what do you want the people in this room to do?
There is so much that you can do. I mean, I think, this is one of those rare opportunities on environmental campaigning where we're not trying to clean up the damage or try and reduce something once that harm has already been created. This is one of those rare opportunities to actually stop an industry before it causes that harm. And, we don't have a moratorium in place. I think where, I lead Greenpeace's global campaign, and in the 40 countries that are calling for a moratorium, each of those decisions has happened because people have written to their governments. They've spoken to their governments. Scientists have, done presentations. People have written to their parliamentarians. And they've made this an issue. We know that this is never going to be the biggest issue in the world, but it is one of, the fundamental questions, I think, about, is nowhere on this planet sacred? Is there nowhere that we can keep off limits? And so actually, raising the sort of public alarm about this is really important. And that is what has led to each of those governments calling for a moratorium or a pause. So, we've got
where does
40,
the UK
there's many
stand,
others.
Louisa?
The UK does support a moratorium in sort of rhetorically, at least, but they're not being particularly active in pushing for that. So I think that would be a great thing to push the UK government on. I think from the renewable energy sector or the electric vehicle sector, there's also so much that can be done to, as you say, have this honest conversation. I think when I first started working on deep sea mining about 10 years ago and was speaking to renewable energy developers, a lot of them were pretty horrified that their sort of industry's name was being used by these deep sea mining companies as greenwash, essentially. And that's why we've now seen 70 businesses that are involved in the clean energy sector or financing the transition actually saying publicly, we will not source from deep sea metals because the environmental risks are too great. And that makes a huge difference, I think, as a result of that. And these are companies like Volkswagen, Renault, Samsung, Google, Apple, so sort of big tech companies and electric vehicle companies, battery companies. That has actually, we've seen a real pivot, I think, from the deep sea mining companies that they're not able to make that argument and be believed so much because actually the companies that are really involved in actually delivering the clean energy transition are saying, we don't want anything to do with it. So I think for those of you who are involved in green energy, actually, making sure, does your company have that exclusion policy? We're seeing the number increase and actually accelerate in the last 12 months, including from the financial side. I think there's now sort of over 80 financial institutions that have said, we will not finance this. It just doesn't line up with our sustainability policies. So, I think proving that there is no social license for this industry is really important, as well as using all of those levers that we have to contact our MPs, to contact governments, signing petitions. And, governments are showing up to these international negotiations every March, every July, how many letters do they get ahead of them from people saying, this is what we want you to actually negotiate. This is the line we want you to take. We care about the ocean. It doesn't need to be more sophisticated than that. I think actually that sort of public care is what has led to putting Antarctica off limits, to protecting whales, to, taking action against plastic pollution. It is really that care, and actually that public legitimacy is so important, because if this industry has shown that there isn't public support, there isn't demand from the companies and the sectors that the deep sea mining companies would like there to be, then it stops being politically viable. And then actually we have, a landmark environmental win. And I think we all need far more of those, particularly at this point in history.
But it's just to back that up, it is a PR battle. Because if you speak to anyone in the UK about deep sea mining, they might have some sort of idea about what it is, but most, I would say, if you ask them, they wouldn't. And if you look at Gerard Barron, as you say, he comes from a PR background. I didn't know that. It makes sense now, because he is on every kind of US news network talking about golf balls on a driving range. That's how he equates the nodules on the sea floor. It's, you see a golf ball on a driving range, you just go and pick it up and look, you've got this precious metal. But we need our own PR battle from the side of no. And I don't think we have that just yet. And it's great that all these corporates have come on board and that they're saying, no, we're not going to use these metals. But I think until there is that public voice which says no, then you're not going to get the pressure on governments. You're not going to get pressure on other companies to fall into line. So there needs to be a PR battle from the likes of Greenpeace, and I'm sure you're fighting it every single day, but to try and communicate to the general public that this is what's going on, this is potentially what might happen, and the dangers of it.
Oliver. I mean, from my side, I think the strongest case of this is the financial argument. The financial argument just doesn't add up. They're presenting financial arguments and cases, sources of raw materials and other. Before we even get into the environmental impact and on the extraordinary life which supports all life on our planet, just at a basic financial level. So, what can we do? It's to report on what the facts are and hold account where people are talking bullshit, which is a lot when it's coming out from TMC and others at the moment. The facts are not being presented accurately. And we live, as we know, in a world at the moment where people are more than happy to put out information which is false. And we're seeing that time and time again. And we need to stand up to it. And that is what we can all do in different forums and different ways to ensure that the facts are actually reported, particularly around finances, particularly when it comes to the supply chain and these companies. Because if they know that their consumers are not going to go along with it, then they are making those decisions, and they are the ones who are ultimately being able to pull the lever on the finances which these companies need. But the financial cases doesn't add up.
As ever with events at the Conduit, this is a really well-informed and energized audience, so thank you. I want to take just one final round of questions from you before we bring the panel to a close. A gentleman in the front row there, and there's one more here, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 quick questions. You spoke a lot about the metals company tonight. Are there any other companies which are making as loud a noise as them in this sector? And then the other question is, you've talked a lot about government's reluctance for deep sea mining, but then you also spoke about PNG and how they lost a lot of money when this company went bankrupt. So why is PNG still allowing exploration licenses?
Thank you. And let's just take a question from the gentleman here as well. There's a mic coming to you, sir, so that everyone can hear you. It's speeding its way to you now. He's dashing across the room towards you.
Hi. How enforceable are the laws of the sea? I mean, you think of parallels such as anti-whaling and relying on people in rubber boats, Greenpeace back in the 90s doing that. And what's to stop a sort of North Korean company that isn't one of the 40 countries to exploit it on their own? Is there anything to restrict them other than economics?
Luke, do you want to take the first question about the metals company? Who else?
So there are the metals companies by far and away the one that we focus on. There are smaller ones that are looking at metals in crusts and vents and things like that. But the reason that we are focused on the metals company is that they are the ones that are, as mentioned before, putting the case out, funding the research. They are the ones demonstrating that they apparently have the technology to do this, that, and the other. And it's a huge engine that they have. And so that's one why we always focus on it, because they are the benchmark. And if that's the company that falters, then that's a big win, and then the others would hopefully fall into line. I don't want to push too far on that.
Okay. And what's China's position? Is that a question? That was a question that I wanted to ask you, Louisa, earlier, so thank you for asking it. What is China's position?
So China hold exploration licenses, similar to the UK government do as well. I think it's something that they are interested in keeping an option open. They don't support a moratorium at this stage, but at the moment it is only the US government who are seeking to sort of go outside of international law and actually start mining. The only actual mining application that's come in right now is from the metals company that's gone to the US administration. And I think picking up on your point around scale earlier, that is for 65,000 kilometers squared. Estimates of how much terrestrial mining, the total footprint on land, are between sort of 57,000 and 100,000. So in one application, we could be looking at potentially doubling or nearly doubling the entire terrestrial mining footprint, which is a lot. But yeah, I think China, what we've heard, and my colleagues in Beijing are sort of picking up, is that China don't feel ready to start. They haven't made up their mind yet. There's a lot of consultation that's going on. It was sort of within the government. Various academics are doing more and more. There was actually an article in Nature recently from 2 Chinese academics saying we don't have the baseline information. So I think sort of a precautionary approach, but something that they are monitoring. And I think on the sort of question about Papua New Guinea and the sort of potential contradictions within that position, I think totally stopping an entirely new industry is difficult. And we're seeing within governments that have a moratorium position, there are sometimes contradictions between different ministries. What I know is that in Papua New Guinea, there's a sort of national ocean consultation that is going on, because there were ministries that were surprised to hear last year that actually there was a ship that was going out doing exploration. There were ministers who said, we didn't know about that. And so I think actually that sort of reinforced the need to have much more scrutiny and accountability to actually check what is going on out there, because sometimes, that's even within national waters, but it can still be sort of fairly far offshore. So I think, this sort of idea that because a government has said we support a moratorium, that's sort of set and will be, totally implemented, is something that of course requires follow-up. Campaigning is never really finished. And I think whaling is an example of that, where a moratorium has made a huge difference, but obviously the job is not entirely done.
Louisa, do you want to take the question about the law of the sea as well? Who are the police of the sea?
Yes, so I think, essentially, because it is such a fundamental part of international law, it doesn't just cover deep sea mining, it covers freedom of navigation, it covers maritime boundaries, it covers safety of sailors at sea. There's sort of that, quid pro quo that governments follow part of it so that they get the benefits from the other parts, whether that's defending their own maritime estate or having the freedom to engage in forms of research at sea. So it's, as with all international laws, there is no international police force, but it's sort of, I think, incumbent on all governments to uphold their obligations so that they also benefit from the rights of it. And I think, we will see a lot of pressure on governments to make sure that none of their nationals are participating in what would be seen as illegal deep sea mining if it is only approved by President Trump, because that actually starts to unpick international law. I mean, the last few weeks, I think, have been a reminder to everyone of how important international rules at sea are, because of the consequences that can be catastrophic across the globe.
And if you look at whaling for an example, so you have Iceland, Norway, Japan, who have rejected the moratorium, but that means that they can't trade apart from within those countries. So if you get the USA, for example, if they are so determined that they want to do what they want to do, then they won't be able to trade with countries that the part of the moratorium. So it'll just be within, it'll just be within the states that they could.
Thank you. Oliver, did you want to come in?
Yes, just on China quickly. I mean, they have the fastest growing and the largest marine research vessel fleet in the world, and more vessels coming into operation quickly. And so the use and application of their research, it is focused on, there is a large focus on mapping the seabed and on mineral exploration as well. So we can see a lot of that, is being done within China from an academic standpoint, but the dual use and application of that within China is obviously well known as well. The other piece within Asia relates to Japan as well, and other funders are involved. The Japanese government are involved in the funding of exploration to see if they can get it to a size where it is commercially viable. And that's happening within Japanese territorial waters rather than on the high seas. But that's a different economic equation because they're balancing their numbers on national security, where they get a majority of the particular rare earth metals from China. And Japan and China have not always seen eye to eye. So they are, so when one adds in the economic equations related to financial to security issues and financial economic security issues, it becomes a different equation, which makes the case in Japan, for example, an interesting one to watch, because if they can show that it is viable and they can then invest in the processing side of it as well, then we've got a step towards a far more likely viability, which is of great concern.
Thank you. Okay, I just want to ask you all one final question, and that is to name your favorite creature of the deep. Oliver, you first.
Well, you told me I couldn't talk about dicks, so I'm going
go for it.
Well, we deal with a lot of species on an ocean census, about to announce 1,000 new species discovered. Barnacles, something I always enjoy. They've got a body to penis ratio of 1 to 8, which is pretty extraordinary.
Enviable.
Yeah, I think it'd be quite hard work. But limpets I've fallen in love with today. I've discovered a new limpet because limpets have the strongest biological material known on Earth because of their teeth. They're very good at hanging on to stuff. So limpets.
Brilliant. Louisa.
I'm quite a fan of the gummy squirrel because it does just look like a jelly sweet. But on a recent expedition that was down to the deep sea in Argentinian waters, Schmidt Ocean filmed this telescope fish, which is kind of terrifying to look at. It almost looks like it's sort of having a terrible morning and has these sort of pearlescent eyes, but it looks kind of horrified by everything. But it's pretty extraordinary that it's living down there. So
it's just
Google
heard
that.
about the metals company.
Maybe.
Yeah. Luke.
I would go for the barrel-eyed fish. You have to Google it. Basically, it's a fish where the top of its skull and the skin is completely transparent, so you can actually see inside, and you can see its eyes and all the everything, the mechanics of it all. Google it, the barrel-eyed fish.
Thank you, Luke.
And yours?
And mine, the Barbie pig, just for its colour. Beautiful little creature. Okay. Thank you all very much for coming. I want to just remind you that I have a book here. It's for sale. If you buy a copy, my children can have a pair of shoes, maybe a hot meal tomorrow, who knows. Thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate it, for braving the tube strike. And thank you very much to my panel. Big hand, please.
And on behalf of us and the club, can I thank you as well for hosting us so brilliantly and to plug your wonderful book again. Thank you.